All right, so we had some pretty crazy news coming out of Sri Lanka over the last couple of days where it appears like the roughly 22 million inhabitants of this small island nation off of the coast of India have just about had it with their corrupt and dysfunctional government and effectively decided to storm the presidential palace and occupy it as a means of protesting the current economic and political situation that average Sri Lankans are facing. So I got a breakdown here from the AP on exactly what caused this crisis and what the potential next steps are going to be. And then we're going to go ahead and watch a video of exactly what these scenes look like on the ground and hear from a couple of the protesters who were taking part in this event. So here to start us off from the AP, they say why Sri Lanka's economy collapsed and what's next. So a little bit of details here. They say Sri Lanka's prime minister said late last month that the island nation's debt-laden economy had collapsed as it ran out of money to pay for food and fuel, and short of cash to pay for imports of such necessities and already defaulting on its debt. It is seeking help from neighboring India and China and from the International Monetary Fund, which, if you know anything about the practices of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, never a good situation for countries who are forced to step in and rely on the IMF to bail them out of economic crises like this. If anything, the IMF would basically be enforcing extreme austerity on people who are already suffering during this type of moment under the guise of like fiscal responsibility. So I think that would be an absolute disaster. But in terms of what's actually on the table for them, seems like their options are limited here, other than, again, outside of help from India and China. But they continue saying Prime Minister, and I'm going to do my best on this name, Ranil Wickremesinghe, who officially took office in May, was emphasizing the monumental task he faced in turning around an economy that he said was heading for rock bottom. And on Saturday, both he and President Gotabaya Rajapaksa agreed to resign amid mounting pressure from protesters who stormed both of their residences and set fire to one of them. So, nothing but solidarity with these protesters. But they say the government owes $51 billion and is unable to make interest payments on its loan, let alone put a dent in the amount borrowed. And tourism, an important engine of economic growth, has sputtered because of the pandemic and concerns about safety after terrorist attacks in 2019. And its currency has collapsed by 80%, making imports more expensive and worsening inflation that is already out of control, with food costs rising 57% according to official data. And the result is a country hurtling towards bankruptcy with hardly any money to import gasoline, milk, cooking gas, and toilet paper. And they say political corruption is also a problem. Not only did it play a role in the country squandering its wealth, but it also complicates any financial rescue for Sri Lanka. And they say Anit Mukherjee, a policy fellow and economist at the Center for Global Development in Washington, said any assistance from the IMF or the World Bank should come with strict conditions to make sure that the aid isn't mismanaged. So again, hearing straight from the IMF and the World Bank, they will impose extreme fiscal austerity on Sri Lanka if that's what it ends up coming down to, which would not be beneficial to average people within the country, but nonetheless seems like they're in a pretty catastrophic situation. But they continue here saying, how is it affecting real people? Tropical Sri Lanka normally is not lacking for food, but people are going hungry. And the UN World Food Program says nearly 9 of 10 families are skipping meals or otherwise skimping to stretch out their food, while 3 million are receiving emergency humanitarian aid. So obviously disastrous situation, but even doctors have resorted to social media to try to get critical supplies of equipment and medicine. And growing numbers of Sri Lankans are seeking passports to go overseas in search of work. And government workers have been given an extra day off for 3 months to allow them time to grow their own food. And they say, why is the economy in such dire straits? Well, much of the public's ire has been focused on President Rajapaksa and his brother, former Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa. A little bit of family corruption going on here and nepotism as well. But they say the latter resigned in May after weeks of anti-government protests that eventually turned violent. And conditions have been deteriorating for the past several years. In 2019, Easter suicide bombings at churches and hotels killed more than 260 people, and that devastated tourism, a key source of foreign exchange. And the government needed to boost its revenues as foreign debt for big infrastructure projects soared. But instead, Rajapaksa decided to push through the largest tax cuts in Sri Lankan history. So as they were defaulting on a lot of their debts and it was skyrocketing at the time, they're facing inflationary pressures, he decided to pass through the largest tax cuts in Sri Lankan history. And they say the tax cuts were recently reversed, but only after creditors downgraded Sri Lankan's ratings, blocking it from borrowing more money as its foreign reserves sank. And then tourism flatlined again during the pandemic. And they finish off here saying in April of 2021, Rajapaksa suddenly banned imports of chemical fertilizers. The push for organic farming caught farmers by surprise and decimated staple rice crops, driving prices higher. And to save on foreign exchange, imports of other items deemed to be luxuries were also banned. Meanwhile, the Ukraine war that has pushed prices of food and oil higher. And inflation was near 40% and food prices were up nearly 60% in May. So obviously it seems like it's a pretty complicated issue here, a multitude of factors that are playing a role in this. You have decreased levels of tourism, both due to terrorist attacks and due to the pandemic. You have corruption at the highest levels within the presidential office. Obviously a little bit of nepotism going on with this Rajapaksa family that has been in charge of this country for years now. On top of that, you obviously have the foreign debts that they are holding. You have the shortage of food as a result of the Ukraine war and a multitude of other factors. It's obviously a very complicated issue. I don't know that there's any one specific factor that you could point to that has necessarily caused this violent revolt from the people of Sri Lanka, but nonetheless, they've decided to take matters into their own hands and again decided to completely storm the presidential palace, and some of the clips from this were just absolutely fucking amazing. So let's go ahead and watch this little video breakdown of what it was looking like on the ground at the time from Al Jazeera.
They called Saturday D-Day, when protesters say the president and his government would be forced to step down. They blame Gotabaya Rajapaksa for an economic crisis that's made life unbearable for many of the country's 22 million people. After breaking through barricades, yet another unprecedented moment. The demonstrators stormed into the president's official residence in Colombo. Inside, this is what it looked like. The president was moved by his security team to an undisclosed location earlier, while protesters ransacked his bedroom and took photographs on his bed. Within moments, the presidential pool, once reserved for the country's top leaders, appeared more like a community pool.
Today is the Independence Day for me, being born in this nation, not 1948. Because today we have fought for our freedom from the tyranny, from the scoundrels, from the blackguards, from the rascals, the rogues, and the greedy politicians who have run our nation below ground zero.
All right, so again, clearly, I mean, you see some of the scenes there. We got people jumping into, the presidential pools. We got them sleeping in his bed, just absolutely taking over his shit with absolutely no remorse. So honestly, you love to see it. If this is a true, people's movement that is overthrowing a massively corrupt government that is serving the interests of the elites and not serving the interests or the needs of the overwhelming majority of working class people within Sri Lanka, then, I think that they really had this type of thing coming. So, in terms of what the next steps are, it looks like they are putting together some form of a coalition government that will serve for like roughly the next 6 months until they can put together some sort of elections to install the next government after this. But again, you have high-level politicians, the president stepping down, resigning, and hopefully this is actually an opportunity for average people within Sri Lanka to have a voice and true representation within their government. So again, nothing but solidarity with these people, and hope they had fun swimming in the presidential pool there. So to give a little bit more context in terms of the broader picture right now, obviously it's not just Sri Lanka that is facing political turmoil right now. You have countries all across the world who are facing exacerbated situations because of a multitude of different factors: the pandemic, the supply chain breakdowns as a result of COVID. Also, the Ukraine war has been having an absolutely massive impact in terms of global food production. And so this is really something that I think people should be focusing in on if you want to get a better idea of what the next couple of months and years are going to be looking like, especially around the Middle East and North Africa, which heavily relies on Ukraine and Russia for food imports. We really are looking at like unprecedented times right now in terms of potential for political instability and potential for uprisings across the developing world, where because of these food shortages, because of the shortages in basic supplies, you could be seeing disastrous consequences, massive spikes in inflation, massive spikes in hunger. And again, as pointed out here by Al Jazeera, it appears like literally millions and millions of people are currently dependent on food that is not able to get out of Ukraine and the rest of that area because of the Russian invasion. So for a little bit of context here from Anna Nagurny, who is apparently a crisis management studier at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, she said this needs to happen in the next couple of months or so, or it's going to be horrific, meaning opening up the export supply lines for Ukraine to export a lot of their grain. But they say that 400 million people worldwide are relying on Ukrainian food supplies. And the UN Food and Agricultural Organization, the FAO, projects up to 181 million people in 41 countries could face a food crisis or worse levels of hunger this year. So we're talking about, again, almost 200 million people in dozens and dozens of countries around the world. So obviously this video was centered around Sri Lanka, but expect to hear more and more of these stories coming in the immediate future, where people are faced with inflationary pressures, they're faced with other economic crises, they're faced with political corruption, and they just have enough of it. And so they decide to do things like storm the presidential palace and overthrow their government. So we really could be facing unprecedented times in the next couple of weeks and months and years.